Single dad, waiter, stood up for a woman sitting alone. What happened next shocked the entire room. The restaurant was full. Candlelit tables, pressed linens, the kind of place where everything, including the people, was expected to look perfect. She didn't. https://www.youtube.com/@dadlifestories 7 https://www.youtube.com/@dadlifestories 7 The woman sat alone at a corner table, back straight, menu open. A visible scar ran along the side of her face. She wasn't hiding it. She didn't need to. But the table next to her had other opinions. A whisper. Then another. A man flagged down a passing server and leaned in close. "Can we be moved?" "It's affecting our evening." His wife didn't even look up. She'd already decided. Within minutes, 2 more tables had complained. The manager straightened his jacket and began walking over. Measured steps. The kind that meant a decision had already been made before he opened his mouth. She felt it, started folding her napkin, reached for her bag. Then, a figure stepped in front of the manager. One of the waiters. Quiet guy, always kept his head down, never caused problems. He had a daughter who waited for him in the back every shift, drawing pictures on napkin paper. He looked at the manager, then at the room full of people who'd decided a stranger didn't belong here. Then he turned, walked to her table and said, calm as anything, "They can have the whole restaurant. You're staying, and I'll take care of you myself." The room went still. Why would a man with everything to lose risk it all for a woman he'd never met? And what did he know that everyone else in that room didn't? Daniel Reeves had a system. Not written down anywhere, not something he'd ever explained to another person, but a system nonetheless, built over 6 years of working the floor at Maison Verlaine, the kind of restaurant where the bread cost more than most people's lunches, and the sommelier spoke about wine like it was scripture. The system was simple. Keep your head down, do the work, don't become a story. He'd learned early that the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do was be memorable. Memorable meant noticed. Noticed meant examined. And examination in a place like this almost always ended the same way, with a quiet conversation in the manager's office and a handshake that didn't mean goodbye so much as "you're no longer our problem." So Daniel kept the system. He folded napkins with military precision. He memorized wine pairings he'd never tasted himself. He smiled at the right moments and disappeared at the others. He had a daughter to feed, a lease that didn't care about his principles, and exactly 11 months left before Maya could finish her school year without disruption. 11 months. Then they could think about something else. He checked his watch. 7:14 p.m. and scanned the floor. The Friday dinner service at Maison Verlaine ran like a performance, which was appropriate because that's exactly what it was. The lighting was calibrated to make everyone look like the best version of themselves. The acoustics had been engineered so that individual conversations remained private, while the collective hum suggested importance, intimacy, success. The clientele understood their role, arrive groomed, order confidently, signal to the room and to themselves that they were people who belonged in rooms like this. Daniel had watched it long enough to stop being impressed. He moved through his section with the quiet efficiency he was known for, refilling water glasses before they were half empty, presenting dishes with just enough ceremony to satisfy without feeling theatrical, reading the emotional temperature of each table with the accuracy of someone who'd spent years learning how to survive other people's moods. Table 7. Anniversary. Wife not happy about something that had nothing to do with the food. Table 9. Business dinner. The younger man was trying too hard. The older one had already decided. Table 12. Celebrating something. Didn't matter what. They'd tip generously and leave by 9. He'd learned to read a room the way some people read weather. not predicting exactly what would happen, but knowing which way the wind was turning. That's how he noticed her before most of the other staff did. She came in at 7:22. Reservation for 2, name he didn't catch. The host brought her to a corner table, one of the smaller ones, tucked slightly apart from the main floor. Whether that was a coincidence or a quiet calculation, Daniel couldn't say. Either way, she didn't seem to mind. She sat down, placed her bag on the adjacent chair, and opened her menu with the focused composure of someone who wasn't here for the atmosphere. She was perhaps 30, well-dressed, a dark blazer, simple jewelry, nothing that tried too hard. Her posture was exact, controlled. The posture, Daniel had come to recognize, of someone who had learned that how they held themselves was often the first argument they had to win. The scar ran from just below her left cheekbone to the edge of her jaw. Not subtle, not hidden. She wore it the way she wore everything else, without apology, without explanation, like it was simply part of the arrangement of her. Daniel noticed, filed it away, moved on. He had tables to attend to. "Dad." The voice came from the narrow corridor beside the service station, a small alcove that had no official purpose, but had become, over the last 3 years, Maya's corner. 8 years old, patient in the way that children of working parents often are, she'd claimed the space with a folded blanket on an upturned milk crate and a seemingly infinite supply of napkins she'd converted into artwork. Daniel glanced over. "You're supposed to be doing homework." "I finished." He raised an eyebrow. "Most of it," she amended. He suppressed a smile. 2 more hours, then we go." Maya accepted this with the philosophical resignation of someone who had learned which battles were worth fighting. She pulled her knees up, set a fresh napkin on her lap, and selected a pen from the small collection she kept in her jacket pocket like a surgeon with instruments. "There's a lady sitting by herself," she said, not looking up. "There are several ladies sitting by themselves. The one by the window, the corner one. She keeps looking at the door." Daniel glanced in the direction his daughter was describing without making it obvious. The woman had lowered her menu. She was holding her phone, not scrolling. Just holding it. Waiting. "She's expecting someone," he said. "She looks nervous." People in restaurants are always nervous. It's the prices. Maya considered this. She doesn't look nervous about prices. The precise observation of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't watching. She looks sad. Like when you wait for someone and they don't come. Like when I waited for you that one time and the bus was really late and I thought maybe you forgot. Daniel said nothing to that. He picked up his order pad and returned to the floor. The trouble started quietly, the way it always did in places like this. Not with shouting or confrontation. That would have been too honest. It started with looks. The couple at the adjacent table, mid-50s, the kind of well-dressed that announced wealth without celebrating it, had noticed her. The wife first, a glance that lasted a second too long, something behind the eyes shifting from curiosity to assessment to a conclusion Daniel had seen people reach before. The kind that came from somewhere beneath logic, beneath reason, from whatever part of a person had decided before they walked in the door what kind of world they were entitled to inhabit. The husband followed his wife's gaze, said something. She made a small sound in response. A minute passed. The husband flagged down Marcus, one of the younger servers. Leaned in. Marcus nodded twice, straightened up, and made his way toward the service station with the careful neutrality of someone carrying information they didn't want to be responsible for. "Pemberton, at table 6, Marcus said quietly, passing Daniel without making eye contact. "They want to move. Or they want something done." Daniel didn't ask what something meant. He already knew. "Not your section," he said. "Wasn't asking your advice." But Marcus kept walking, and Daniel noticed he didn't go to the manager's station straight away. He found something to fold, something to arrange, somewhere else to be, buying time, or conscience. The woman at the corner table didn't acknowledge the change in the room's attention. Either she hadn't noticed, which Daniel doubted, or she had learned to perform not noticing the way she'd learned to perform everything else. She looked at her menu again. She checked her phone again. She set it down on the table, face up. The message she was waiting for hadn't come. At table 6, the wife said something to a passing server, not Marcus this time, but Sophie, the newest member of the floor staff, who was 17 days into the job and not yet equipped to navigate the particular social geometry of this kind of request. Sophie's expression went through something complicated and unresolved, and she moved away quickly. Then another table. Daniel watched it happen with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to observe without appearing to. Table 6 had been the first stone dropped in still water. Now the ripples were moving outward. A glance from table 4, a murmur at table 11. The collective discomfort of a room that had decided, without voting, that something was wrong, and that the wrongness was located in the woman sitting alone at the corner table who was waiting for someone who hadn't arrived, and who had a scar she hadn't hidden, and who, as far as Daniel could determine, had not said a single word to anyone since she sat down. She had done nothing. That was the thing. She had done absolutely nothing. He was at the service station refilling a water pitcher when he heard Renard's voice. "Mr. Renard, the floor manager, a careful man. Not cruel, Daniel had always thought. Just deeply committed to the idea that his job was to maintain the comfort of the majority, and that arithmetic applied consistently had kept him employed and untroubled for 14 years. We have some concerns from several guests." Daniel set the pitcher down. Renard was already crossing the floor, walking with the measured purpose of a man who had rehearsed this type of conversation enough times that he'd stopped feeling it. He straightened his jacket as he walked. A small, automatic gesture, preparing his armor. Across the room, she looked up. She saw him coming, and Daniel watched something happen in the architecture of her face. Not collapse, not fear, but the quiet, terrible recognition of someone who had arrived at this moment before, who had known on some level, before she'd even sat down, that this moment might find her. She reached for her bag. She began to fold her napkin. And something happened in Daniel's chest that had nothing to do with policy or position or the 11 months between now and the end of the school year. "Dad." Maya's voice from the alcove. He'd almost moved without it. But her voice was what crystallized the thing that had been forming in him since 7:22, since he'd watched a woman sit down by herself and the room decide she should leave. He looked at his daughter. She was watching the woman the way she watched things she was still trying to understand, with the full, uncomplicated attention of someone who hadn't yet learned that looking directly at the world was something people were supposed to outgrow. "Why is she sad?" Maya asked. Daniel set down the pitcher. It was a simple question, the kind that children asked and adults spent entire lifetimes constructing elaborate answers to, or learning to ignore, or deciding was not their business. "She's not sad," he said. "She is," Maya said, with the certainty of someone for whom the word sad was not a diagnosis, but simply a thing you could see, the way you could see color or distance. He looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he looked at Renard halfway across the floor, then at the woman, whose hand was now on the clasp of her bag. 11 months, a voice said. "You can't afford this." He took a step toward table 12, stopped, set the water pitcher down on the service station with more care than it required, as though the act of setting it down carefully might resolve something. His hand stayed on the handle. He thought about the lease, about Maya's school, about the 11 months and the system he had built around them, the deliberate, load-bearing architecture of keeping his head down and his problems small and his daughter's life uninterrupted. He thought about walking back to his section and letting Renard handle it. It would be over in 2 minutes. She would leave, the room would settle. Tomorrow he would still have a job, and Maya would still have her school, and the system would still be intact. He thought about Maya asking him later, "How was work? What happened?" And he thought about what he would say. He thought about his daughter, 8 years old, who had spent more evenings than he could count in a service corridor watching the world from the edges of other people's rooms, and who still, somehow, moved through every space with her chin up. He thought about where she had learned that. He thought about what she would learn tonight if he walked back to table 12. He let go of the picture. He straightened his jacket, the same gesture as Renard but meaning something entirely different. And he walked. He stepped in front of the manager a second before the manager reached the table. Renard stopped, looked at him with the precise, contained irritation of a man whose process had been interrupted. Daniel didn't explain, didn't ask permission. He looked at Renard, then slowly turned his attention to the room, to the tables that had complained, to the carefully arranged faces, to the whole architecture of quiet judgment that had decided by consensus that one woman's presence was a problem requiring management. Then he turned to her. She was looking at him, not with hope. She was past hope for the moment. She was looking at him the way people looked at the last thing before they stopped expecting anything. He pulled out his order pad, set it on the table, and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear the first part of it. "Whatever you're waiting for, don't go yet. Whatever's taking them this long, it'll be worth it." Then a beat louder, for the room, for Renard, for the principle of the thing. "They can have the whole restaurant. You're staying, and I'll take care of you myself." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room that had expected something different and wasn't sure yet what to do about getting the opposite. Renard stood very still behind him. Maya, from her alcove, had stopped drawing. The woman at the corner table lowered her hand from her bag, and Daniel, for the first time in 6 years, had broken the system entirely, and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, completely certain it was the right thing to do. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Daniel counted them without meaning to. An old habit from years of reading tables, measuring the space between an offer and a response, learning to tell the difference between a pause that was thinking and a pause that was refusal. This one was neither. It was the silence of a room recalibrating, of people who had expected a particular outcome and were now, quietly, privately, without admitting it to themselves, processing the fact that a different outcome had occurred. Renard was still behind him. Daniel could feel it without turning around, could feel the weight of the man's consideration, the arithmetic running behind his careful eyes. Guest comfort, staff conduct, precedent, liability, the 14 years of untroubled employment, and the particular calculus that came with it. Daniel didn't move, didn't look back. He kept his attention on the woman, who had not yet let go of her bag, not completely, as though releasing it required something she wasn't sure she had. "I'll get you some water," he said. It was a small thing to say, almost absurdly ordinary given what had just happened. But that was the point. He said it the way he would have said it to any table, with the same neutral professionalism, as though the last 60 seconds had been routine, as though this were simply the next step. She looked at him for a moment longer, searching for something, the catch, the condescension, the particular brand of pity that arrived wearing the costume of kindness. She didn't find it. "Thank you," she said. Quiet. Steady. He nodded and turned. Renard was waiting 2 feet behind him. "A word," the manager said. "After service." He said it without breaking stride, without hostility, with the same tone he used when he was running 3 tables simultaneously and didn't have time for side conversations. As though there were nothing unusual about the exchange. As though he were not a man who had just walked to the edge of something and jumped. He heard Renard say nothing in response, which, he understood, was not the same thing as agreement. But it wasn't dismissal either. It was the sound of a man recalibrating his own arithmetic, weighing the disruption of making a scene against the disruption that had already been made, and finding no clean solution. For now, that was enough. At the service station, Daniel paused. He looked at what he had available: water, a fresh glass, a clean linen cloth still folded in quarters. He looked at the corner table. The way the existing setup sat, the standard arrangement that the restaurant placed at every table, functional, correct, deliberately unremarkable. Something formed in him. Not impulsive. He was not an impulsive man. But clear. The way things were sometimes clear when you had stopped arguing with yourself and simply decided. He gathered what he needed. He did not rush. The glass he selected was the one they kept for the private dining room. Slightly larger, heavier, the kind that caught candlelight differently. He filled it from the filtered carafe, not the standard pitcher. He took a fresh linen from the stack that had been pressed that morning, unfolded it, refolded it into something that took a shape beyond function. He found the small bud vase that lived behind the espresso station, a single stem of white freesia, changed daily for the bar, currently replaced and set aside. He carried these things across the floor. He was aware of the room watching him. He allowed it. He moved with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything, and he set the glass down first, then the linen, then the vase at the corner of the table. Not fussing, not performing, but arranging things with the care of someone who believed the arrangement mattered. He adjusted the candle. The table had one already, but it was sitting at the wrong angle and casting more shadow than warmth. He rotated it 2 inches clockwise. Then he stood back and assessed. The table was, by every measurable standard, nicer than it had been. Not extravagantly, not in a way that would read as a statement to the room, but to the person sitting at it, in the way that small, careful details communicated something that larger gestures never could. You are worth the attention. The woman was watching him. Your waiter stepped away, Daniel said. You're in my section now. Whatever you need. She looked at the table, at the vase, the glass, the adjusted candle. She looked at him. You didn't have to do that. It's my job, he said simply, which was, in some sense, true. And in some more important sense, beside the point. The reaction at table 6 was not immediate. It arrived, as most reactions in places like this did, by degrees. First a glance. The husband, watching Daniel's return journey across the floor with the faint compression around the eyes that meant he'd seen something he hadn't expected. Then a murmur to his wife. She turned, assessed the corner table, turned back. Something in her face moved through several expressions before settling on one that was harder to name. Not quite anger, not quite embarrassment, but somewhere in the territory between them where people went when the world had declined to confirm their judgment. At table 11, a woman in a gold dress had stopped her conversation mid-sentence. Her companion followed her gaze. Daniel didn't acknowledge any of it. He checked on table 7, the anniversary couple, still navigating whatever subterranean disagreement had followed them through the door, and refilled their glasses and said the right things in the right tone. He attended to table 12, who were celebrating something and grateful for the attention. He moved through his section with the same economy of motion as always. But he was aware, in the precise and peripheral way that years of floor work had trained him, of what was happening across the room. The whispers had changed register. Before, they had been about her, about the woman at the corner table, her presence, her scar, the affront of her simply existing in a space that had not allocated room for her. Now they were about what Daniel had done, which was a different conversation, carrying different weights. Some of it was confusion. Some of it was irritation. At table 6, the husband flagged the passing server with more force than was necessary. He found Marcus at the service station. Pemberton's unhappy, Marcus said, before Daniel could speak. He says you've made a statement. His words. I brought someone a better glass. He's calling it preferential treatment. He flagged down servers twice to complain about a customer who hasn't said a word to anyone. What would he call that? Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, looked briefly like a man caught between two versions of a conversation he didn't want to have. He was not a bad person. Daniel had worked alongside him for 3 years and knew that much. He was, primarily, a person who had learned that the least complicated route was usually the correct one. "Renard is watching," he said finally. "I know." "Daniel, I know." He picked up a breadbasket for table 9 and moved. "Dad?" He was passing the alcove when he heard her. He expected the question to be about dinner, or homework, or whether they could stop at the small bakery near the apartment that stayed open late on Fridays if the shift ended in time. Instead, he turned and found Maya holding something out toward him. A folded napkin, the kind she always drew on, and she had drawn on this one. A small figure with careful, precise lines, standing next to what appeared to be a table with a candle on it. The style was unmistakable. 8 years old, nothing wasted, every mark deliberately made. Below it, in her careful block letters, "For the lady." He looked at his daughter. "She kept looking at the door," Maya said. "I thought maybe she should have something nice to look at instead." There was no artifice in it, no performance. She was not trying to be poignant. She was simply solving the problem she had identified, with the means she had available, in the way that she solved all problems, directly and with complete sincerity. Daniel looked at the drawing for a moment. "Come on, then," he said. Maya walked beside him across the floor. She had done this before, occasionally, carefully when the service allowed it, accompanied him on brief crossings of the room when the hour was late and the clientele had thinned. She knew to stay close, to be quiet, not to touch things that weren't offered. She was a child who understood the weight of different spaces and moved through them accordingly. But she moved with her head up. Daniel had noticed this before, and it occurred to him now that his daughter, who had spent most of her life in the margins of rooms like this, waiting in alcoves and service corridors, watching the gilded architecture of other people's evenings from a careful distance, nonetheless moved through the world with her chin up, meeting the room directly, unafraid of being looked at. He wondered, not for the first time, where she had learned that. At the corner table, he stopped. He produced the drawing from the inside of his jacket. He'd folded it once more, tucked it there without quite deciding to, and set it on the table. "My daughter wanted you to have this," he said. "She's been working on it." The woman looked at the napkin, then at Maya. Maya, for her part, gave a small nod with the gravity of someone presenting credentials. "You're the special guest," Maya said. "I decided." Something moved across the woman's face. Not the polite, managed expression she had been maintaining since she sat down, but something underneath it, something less constructed. She looked at the drawing for a long moment, at the small figure and the candle. "It looks just like the table," she said. "I made the candle a little bigger," Maya admitted, "for emphasis." A sound came out of the woman that was quiet and surprised and was, Daniel registered, a laugh. A real one. Not the kind that came from social obligation, but the involuntary kind that happened when something caught you off guard in a direction you hadn't expected. From across the room, Daniel was not looking at Renard. But in the peripheral accuracy that 6 years of floor work had trained into him, he registered it anyway. The manager had gone still. He was standing near the bar station with a clean glass in his hand, not polishing it, not setting it down, just holding it, attention fixed on the corner table. On the child, sitting across from a woman who was pressing her fingertips to the edge of a napkin, drawing and laughing for the first time all evening. Renard stood that way for several seconds. Then he set the glass down quietly and moved away, and Daniel could not have said, from this distance, what was on the man's face. He didn't try to read it. He had his own table to attend to. She pressed her fingertips to the edge of the napkin. "Thank you," she said, and then to Maya, "What's your name?" "Maya." "Maya." She said it back like she was making a note of it. "I'm Claire." The room was watching them now. Not all of it, not openly. This was a place of calibrated discretion, where staring was a private act. But Daniel could feel it, the way he'd learned to feel a room, the way the attention had shifted and settled. At table 6, the wife had her hands folded on the table. She was not speaking. She was looking at the corner table with an expression Daniel couldn't quite decipher from this angle, and he wasn't trying to. At table 11, the woman in the gold dress had turned slightly in her chair. At table 4, a man put down his wine glass. The whispers, Daniel noticed, had stopped. He couldn't read what that meant, not yet. It might mean disapproval consolidating into resolve. It might mean the atmosphere had shifted. He had been in this business long enough to know that a room's mood was not a reliable predictor of its actions, and that the same silence could precede confrontation or change. He wasn't doing this for the room's verdict. He refilled Claire's water glass. "Your guest may still come," he said. She looked at her phone, face up on the table. The screen was dark now. "They may," she said. Her voice carried nothing in particular. Not hope, not resignation. Just the fact of it. "If they don't," he said. "The kitchen's best work comes out around 9. The chef tests things after the rush. You'd be welcome to stay." She looked at him with that same careful attention she had turned on him before. Still looking for the catch. Still checking for the angle. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He considered the question honestly. He thought of all the things that were true answers, and all the things that sounded like true answers but weren't quite, and he decided that the shortest version was also the most accurate. "Because my daughter was watching," he said. He picked up his order pad and stepped back. He didn't look at Renard. He didn't look at the tables that had complained. He had one section of the floor to attend to, and one guest in it who hadn't been treated like a guest since she walked through the door. He had work to do. She arrived at 9:07. Daniel noticed her the moment she came through the door, not because she announced herself, but because of the way she didn't. A woman in her 60s, silver-haired, in a coat that had no interest in impressing anyone. She spoke briefly to the host. The host's expression went through a small, controlled change. He nodded once and led her not toward the dining room, but toward the corner of it. Toward Claire's table. Daniel was at the service station. He watched without moving. The woman, he would learn her name later, for now she was simply the arrival, did not hurry. She walked the way people walked when they had already decided something, when they were not moving toward a situation so much as completing it. She passed table 6 without a glance. She passed table 11. She navigated the room with the quiet authority of someone who had been in many rooms and had stopped being impressed by any of them. She reached the corner table and sat down. Claire looked at her. Something passed between them. Not warm exactly, not the reunion of people who had been waiting for each other, more like the recognition between two people who understood the same thing and had been waiting to see if the other one understood it too. Daniel set down the carafe he was holding. He brought 2 menus to the table as a matter of form. The older woman looked up at him when he arrived. She had eyes that cataloged things. He felt it, the way some people made you feel when they looked at you, as though they were reading something beyond your face. "You're the one," she said. It was not a question. "I'm the waiter," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "Yes," she said. "That's what I mean." He handed her a menu. She accepted it without looking at it. He gave them 20 minutes. He attended to table 12. They were on dessert now, the celebration softening into the pleasantly drowsy satisfaction of people who had eaten well and drunk well and were beginning to think about going home. He cleared plates from table 7, The anniversary couple had, at some point in the last hour, resolved whatever had followed them through the door. They were talking now with the easy shorthand of people who had been arguing about the same things for years and had reached, tonight at least, a temporary peace. The floor was quieter. The rush had passed, the kitchen noise had dropped to a low register, and the candlelit hum of the room had taken on the quality of a long exhalation. Renard was at the bar side of the room, speaking to someone. He had not approached Daniel again. Whether this was a reprieve or a postponement, Daniel couldn't determine. He was aware of the corner table at the edge of his attention, the way he was always aware of his tables even when his back was turned. The two women were talking. The conversation was not the kind that required gestures, no hands on the table, no leaning in. They were talking the way people talked when the subject was serious, and the understanding between them was already established. He was not trying to hear it. At 9:31, Claire looked up and found him across the room. She stood up slowly. Daniel was aware of this, the way he was aware of most things happening in his section, peripherally, accurately. But then something in the quality of her standing changed his peripheral attention to full. She stood with the same controlled posture she'd carried since 7:22, but there was something different in it now. Not the tight, maintained composure of someone braced for impact. Something more like a person who had been holding a weight for a long time and had just, quietly, set it down. She looked at the room, not sweeping it, not performing for it, just looking at it in the way you sometimes looked at a place when you were deciding how much of yourself to give to what you were about to say. She was not someone given to public declarations. He had read that about her within the first 10 minutes of watching her, and nothing since had changed his assessment. Whatever she was about to do, it cost her something. She spoke at a volume that carried. "I want to say something." The room shifted. Conversations slowed and lowered. The remaining diners, perhaps a dozen tables still occupied at this hour, turned in the way that people turned when a voice arrived with a weight that preconditioned attention. She didn't look like someone who had planned this. She looked like someone who had decided to do something they would rather not do and had decided anyway. "I just want to say one thing." Her voice was steady but not projected. She wasn't speaking to the room so much as declining to exclude it. Tonight, someone in this room did the obvious thing, the thing that should have required no particular courage. She stopped, looked down at the napkin drawing at the edge of the table. When she looked up again, she was speaking to no one specific, and to everyone. "I've been in a lot of rooms. That doesn't happen as often as it should." She sat back down without looking to see who was listening. The silence lasted longer than 4 seconds this time. Table 6 had gone very still. The husband was looking at the tablecloth. His wife had her wine glass in both hands and was not drinking from it. At table 11, the woman in the gold dress had turned almost fully in her chair to face the corner of the room, and her expression was the expression of someone undergoing a private reckoning they had not scheduled for this evening. Daniel stood at the service station. He did not feel triumphant. He was surprised, a little, to find what he did feel, a kind of simple, functional clarity, as though the question he had been carrying since 7:22, "Was this worth it?" had been quietly and finally answered, and the answer hadn't been dramatic, just settled. Maya appeared at his elbow. She had watched the whole thing from the alcove. He'd been aware of her stillness, the kind that came over his daughter when she was paying very close attention. "She said your name," Maya said. "She didn't know my name. She described you pretty well." Daniel looked at his daughter. In the candlelight, in the late evening quiet of the floor, she looked small and serious and very much herself. "She's going to ask you something," Maya said. "She keeps looking over here," Maya said, "like she wants to say something but she's still thinking about it." He didn't ask how she knew this. Maya had been reading rooms since she was old enough to sit quietly in them. The older woman, Her name, it emerged, was Mrs. Patel. She said it simply, without preamble, when Daniel came to the table. Had a card in her hand when he arrived. She set it on the table but did not push it toward him. "I was supposed to arrive at 7:30, she said. "I didn't." The tone was matter-of-fact, carrying no apology. "I waited across the street. I wanted to see the room without me in it. People behave differently when they know who I am." A pause that had the quality of someone deciding how much background was necessary. "I oversee operations for a group of hospitality properties, 7 restaurants, 2 hotels, currently in the process of opening a third. I've been an investor in this establishment for 4 years. Claire has been helping me evaluate staff across our properties." Another pause. "Among other things." Daniel looked at Claire. She met his gaze with the direct attention he had come to expect from her. "I wasn't hiding it," she said. "I never hide it. That's not how this works." She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. "I was here to see what the room would do, but I don't perform. I need you to understand that. Whatever you saw tonight was real. The waiting, the phone, nearly leaving." A pause. "The discomfort has to be real or it doesn't mean anything. I've done this before. In other cities, the room's reaction is always the same. What changes is whether anyone does something about it." "Tonight took about 8 minutes," Mrs. Patel said, with the dry precision of someone reading a figure from a report. Daniel said nothing. "We're looking for a floor manager for the new property," Mrs. Patel continued. "Someone with the technical competence to run a service, which you have. I've reviewed your record here. And the less quantifiable thing, which is harder to find." She looked at him directly. Tonight demonstrated it clearly. He looked at the card on the table. The address printed on it was across the city, a neighborhood he knew by name but had never worked in, the kind of development that didn't exist 5 years ago and was now the center of everything that was happening. He looked at it for a long moment. What would it mean? He asked. Not for himself, he knew what it would mean for himself, but he was already thinking the way he always thought, in the parallel track that had been running since Maya was born. What does this mean for her? "Better hours," Mrs. Patel said, reading the question accurately. "Consistent schedule, salary rather than hourly, plus service. It would mean your daughter doesn't spend her Friday evenings waiting in a service corridor." Maya, sitting now beside him at the table, Mrs. Patel had gestured her over with a small nod, looked up at him with an expression that was carefully not an expression, the face of someone who very much had an opinion and was very consciously not stating it. He almost smiled. He looked at the card. He looked at Claire, who was watching him with the same careful, searching attention she had turned on him hours ago, still looking, he realized, for the same thing. Not the catch, not anymore. Something else. Some confirmation of the things she thought she had seen. He picked up the card. He turned it over once, set it back down. "I want to answer you honestly," he said. "Please," said Mrs. Patel. "I did what I did tonight because it was the right thing to do. Not because I thought it would lead anywhere. Not because I calculated anything." He looked at Maya. "Because my daughter was watching, and I didn't want her to see a person walk out of a room that had decided she didn't belong there, and think that was simply the way things were." He looked at Mrs. Patel, then at Claire. "If I accept this, I want it to be because I can do good work in the role. Not because I performed well in front of the right person." Mrs. Patel looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had asked a version of this question many times and had learned to tell the difference between the answers. "That's the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in a professional context in several months," she said. Claire reached forward and turned the card back toward him. "Take it home," she said. "Think about it. I'll be here next Friday." He looked at her. "I come most Fridays," she said. And something in the way she said it, matter of fact without apology, made him understand that this too had been part of something longer than one evening. That she had been in this room before, and in rooms like it, and that she came back not because they deserved her presence, but because she had decided she was not going to let rooms like this determine where she went. He picked up the card. Renard found him at the service station at the end of the shift. Daniel waited. "I'm not going to pretend tonight went the way I would have managed it," Renard said. "No," Daniel agreed. "The Pembertons at Table 6 have already emailed the head office." "I know." A pause. Renard was looking at the corner table. Empty now, the bud vase still there, the napkin drawing propped against it. "Mrs. Patel is on the board," he said finally. "She's sent a separate communication. Within the hour." He wasn't presenting it as good news or bad news, just information, set down plainly. Whatever they decide. He stopped, started again, with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing words he hadn't used in a while. "I watched you with the child, with the drawing." He didn't explain what he meant by that, or what he'd done with the thing he'd seen. "You did your job tonight. You did it better than I did." He picked up the clean glass he'd left on the counter and walked toward the bar without waiting for a response. He found Maya at her usual spot in the alcove. She had packed away her pens, folded her blanket, and was sitting with her jacket on and her bag in her lap, the posture of someone who was ready to go and was being very patient about it. She looked up at him. "Good night?" she asked. He sat down beside her on the upturned crate. Across the room, the last of the candles were being snuffed. The floor staff moved through the end-of-service routines with the particular quiet efficiency of people performing the same ritual they would perform tomorrow and the night after that, the steady work of keeping a place running. The corner table was empty now. Claire and Mrs. Patel had gone, but the bud vase was still there, and the heavy glass, and, he could see it from here, the napkin drawing, which had not been left behind but placed carefully against the vase, the small drawn figure and the candle slightly too large for emphasis. "Yes," he said. "Good night." Maya leaned against his shoulder for a moment, the particular unself-conscious weight of a child who had not yet learned to ration her affections. "The lady," she said. "Claire, she smiled at me before she left. A real one." "I know. You can always tell the difference." "Yes," he said. "You can." He sat with his daughter in the quiet end of the room, in the alcove that had been her home for more evenings than either of them could count, and looked at what remained of the night. The clean linens, the extinguished candles, the small drawing standing in a vase of white freesia in the corner of a restaurant that had tried tonight to be less than it was, and had failed, not because of anything grand or declared, but because one person had made a different decision. It was, he thought, always like that. The card was in his pocket. He would think about it at home, at the small kitchen table after Maya was asleep, with a cup of tea going cold beside him. The deliberate, unhurried thinking of a man who had learned that the most important decisions were the ones you didn't make in the moment. He already knew what he would decide. But he believed in taking the time to decide it properly. He stood up. "Ready?" he said. Maya hopped down from the crate, tucked her bag under her arm, and looked up at him with the direct, uncomplicated certainty that he had come to understand was simply her nature. The way she had always met the world, chin up, without flinching. "Ready," she said. They walked out together.